oftentimes, sometimes better. We talked about, someone talked about the antidepressant category being exceptionally ineffective for relative to a placebo. This happens to do with the fact that you look at Prozac, it's fluoxetine, it's actually approximately 30% fluoride, which probably has no role in the body. So of course, it's shocking that any drug beats a placebo, and there are researchers out there that have claimed that 100% of the effectiveness of drugs is due to placebo. So and then Dr. Tim Kapchuk from Harvard really caused quite a stir when he did a study on IBS sufferers, and those who got the milk sugar tablets saw greater improvement in their IBS symptoms, even when they were told it was a placebo. So they were said, this is a placebo, it's not real, we're going to give it to you, and they still improved. So that's a very significant fact, because the assumption has always been that you have to deceive the patient to use a placebo, and that's often been a justification for not using it. It's unethical. Well, it's unethical to give someone fluoride and tell them that that's going to help their depression. Because one of the things I've discovered, is kind of relevant to this talk, is that in the autopsy literature on fluoride, they found a pretty startling association between level of calcification of the pineal gland, which is what René Descartes, 17th century French philosopher and vivisectionist who came up with the mind-body duality. He believed it was the seat of the soul. So the fact that this fluoride is actually calcifying the seat of the soul is pretty disturbing. So fundamentally, what the placebo represents is an externalization into what we're perceiving as an objective substance, a self-healing ability that permeates us every moment. But we're being given permission. In other cultures, or even within some families within this culture, the moment a child's born and they're cognizant of being a self, you reinforce that they heal themselves, or that they are already healing themselves every moment. In this culture, it's infinite reinforcement in the other direction, which is what gives this ritual power, and which constitutes the placebo effect in my understanding. So really, the placebo effect is an illusion in terms of obviously the pill containing any type of healing ability. And I think it also helps to look at the evil twin of the placebo, which is the drug itself. And it's so instructive because, we have this hard and fast distinction in consciousness between waking and dreaming. There's a logos and a mythos, and previous cultures didn't have that. And in language, I love looking up etymologies, because when you look at the original Latin or Greek meaning of a word, you can see its true meaning. And with the word pharmaceutical, it comes from pharmakous, Greek word, which is a drug, okay, we all know that definition, a spell-giving potion, that's another, prisoner, as well as by extension, a magician or a sorcerer. And we all know that pharmaceutical marketing is amazing sorcery. It just completely casts us under a spell, and we start taking what are basically downstream from the petrochemical industry's chemicals, okay? Hydrocarbons that have been turned into fine chemicals, which then, within the pharmaceutical industry's subdivision of the drug company, actually gets then converted into a pharmaceutical. Now, it's not always the case. There's biologicals and things that are still somewhat natural, like monoclonal antibodies, but generally, petrochemical derivatives, that's what pharmaceuticals are, the xenobiotics. So, and then beneath that, unfortunately it's cut off, but pharmakos was the original term that led to all the others, and that was actually a form of a human sacrifice. So, in order for a city to, expunge its sins, it would take someone within the village, and it would ritualistically sacrifice them. It might be a matter of them being run out of the city. And then there's some accounts that we believe might be hyperbolic that show that they actually sacrificed them. But we all know the statistics that believe that drug-based medicine is leading to hundreds of thousands of confirmed deaths every year, which is just startling, considering that the U.S. Centers for Poison Control report 0 deaths associated with supplements. You know, there's actually an estimate of about 50 billion doses of supplements taken by Americans every year. So it's just startling that we allow this, and the definition is so clear that this is basically, you know, it's a meme. It's so powerful, and it's fixation on us that we don't even think it, because really some of the people that came after Dawkins define part of human nature as if we're meme machines, okay? There are all these concepts that are competing for a place in our brain, and some of them sink in, some of them mutate, and we replicate them to others, but to a degree we've lost our autonomy. And this, I think, will be a little bit more clear in the next few examples. Okay, so the rise of biomedicine. Biomedicine is applied natural sciences primarily in clinical practice, and it has brought marvelous things into the world. I mean, the ability to look through someone's body without cutting it. Okay, this is basically a bloodless vivisection through imaging devices. And there's so many of them. We can look down on a molecular level, you know, the genes within, you know, a breast cell. We can determine the specific genes within them. That's remarkable. That approximates a shaman's vision, but it has consequences. And it also reflects objectives that are diametrically opposed to healing. This was Foucault, who said, knowledge is not for knowing, knowledge is for cutting. And I find it karmically interesting that a lot of the biomedicine begins with vivisection. And you know, it's interesting too that Descartes is well known to have described the screams of the animals that he was cutting apart without anesthesia as just being unoiled cogs in these machines. I happen to be the son of an experimental biologist, so when I was a little boy, I'd go into the lab and there'd be a liver still living on a perfusion station. You know, my dad dispassionately, you know, doing his thing, and just a wonderful guy, but it always struck me as rather horrific. And the ultimate consequence downstream is that we end up ourselves on an operating table. There's definitely connections there because of the way in which we're thinking about things. So this is probably one of the most important studies of our time. And one reason why I know that is because of something called scientific embargo. Basically, the journals make an agreement with the publishers. So if you go on Google News Aggregator and suddenly there's 100 studies on the same topic, or 100 stories on the same study, it's because of the scientific embargo. So this was released on November 22nd, okay, of last year, which is Thanksgiving. This is a time when, although everyone's on the web buying things, they aren't going on looking at research. They're with their families, what I was doing actually. And what it did is it looked at the past 30 years of breast screenings in women in the United States. And what it found was that 1.3 million women were likely overdiagnosed, a terrible euphemism, and overtreated for breast cancer. What they also found was, since the beginning of widespread breast screenings in 1985, with the beginning of Breast Cancer Awareness Month, to today, there was a doubling in early stage cancer diagnoses, but they did not find a corresponding decrease in late stage breast cancer diagnoses, meaning they weren't finding cancer early, they were finding something other than cancer, which they were calling cancer and treating. Okay, so this is actually one of the author's diagrams, Gilbert Welch, who's a genius and wrote an amazing book on overdiagnosis, but this is the way it appears when you look at the increase in the early stage diagnoses of breast cancer and then the late stage in an ideal world. So if mammography worked, you'd find this as you get more early stage diagnoses, you see less late stage because you're catching it early. That's the whole idea. But what in fact they found was the opposite, is that early stage breast cancers increased, but late stage didn't really decrease. Maybe a slight decrease, but that's nothing considering how much more cancer you have. And of course then they mapped it against the actual mammography compliance within the population. In 1985, about 30% of the population was getting screened. And then right in the middle, you see the peak, that was about 70%. And then until today, around the same. So it corresponds perfectly with this increase in supposed early stage breast cancers. And they wanted to find, is there another reason for this? Maybe just the overall levels of early stage breast cancer in the population have increased. And when they mean early stage, they mean with x-rays, they're seeing usually calcified lesions. And ductal carcinoma in situ, DCIS, is considered to be the most prevalent mammography detected cancer. It's asymptomatic generally, and this is the big part of the point I'm making, is that this whole system, the Rise of Biomedicine, is looking at asymptomatic populations. So they're not complaining of anything, it's just they're being scanned and they're finding they deviate from some norm. It could be osteoporosis, where now we use the T-score, which is the young adult 25-year-old score of how your bones should be. Even though you're 80, they're saying your bones should be the density of a 25-year-old, and that creates osteopenia diagnoses and osteoporosis, which aren't based on reality. Same with pre-diabetes and lipid screening. So it creates a lot of new disease. So what they did is they looked at the stage-specific incidence of breast cancer in women under 40, just to kind of look and see, okay, are early-stage breast cancers increasing in younger populations? That could explain why we're seeing a doubling in those that we're screening. And they found that that wasn't the case. Early-stage breast cancers were stayed the same as late-stage in the younger populations. So that ruled that explanation out. Okay. So basic conclusion is that X-ray mammography is not living up to its promises. Okay, it's creating all these diagnoses, and keep in mind, these women have been treated as if they have invasive breast cancer. This is the preemptive war doctrine applied to medicine. It's another meme, and it's really what we're seeing is that the militaristic models are now kind of dovetailing with the medical models. And these are two meme plexes, if you will, that are starting to merge. So what we're seeing essentially is that the breast cancers that are being diagnosed are being treated as if they are invasive, and that's considered precautionary. Like women who are given the BRCA1 or 2 gene test, and they're told you're positive. They're not told there's 2,000 to 3,000 natural variations of those genes. So they get a preemptive mastectomy. I mean, so levels of mastectomy have actually risen in the past 5 years. So mastectomy or lumpectomy and radiation, and then you have chemotherapy, and then you have follow-up, usually aromatase inhibitors. And this is, all these women had to deal with that. All these women had to deal with the trauma of diagnosis, which is not reflected into this. And Michel Foucault, French thinker, he used a term called biopower. And his concept was that this is really about controlling bodies. It has nothing to do with medicine in the sense of healing, or the art and science of healing. Let's see. Okay, and this is one of the more disturbing findings, is that I already, in my own research, discovered literature showing that ductal carcinoma in situ, which means basically a cancer that's in place, which is a contradiction in terms. If you have cancer, the concept, the meme is that it expands infinitely until it kills you. Okay, but if you have a non-moving, non-expanding cancer, ductal carcinoma in situ, then it shouldn't even be classified as cancer, and some have called it a stage 0 breast cancer, even though it's treated the same way. But even worse than that is they discovered that 50% of the overdiagnoses that we're talking about here were so-called invasive breast cancers. Now, it got cut off, but the Lancet Oncology published in 2010 a study showing that the natural history of many of these invasive breast cancers is to regress spontaneously within 6 years. So that concept that a cancer can actually regress is not even present within conventional oncology. It's upsetting because that's the reality of what happened to Dr. Charles Majors and anyone who is aware of the natural alternative health movement, which yes is anecdotal based largely. There's thousands of examples of people who have accomplished this by not going the conventional route. And this is really helpful in understanding what's going on. You know, again, cancer comes from the Greek word crab, right, like the zodiacal sign. And, you know, Hippocrates looked at cancer in terms of its, you know, pinches, and it stays in place and then expands outward is another view that Galen gave. So this image is still, you know, burnt into our, you know, collective consciousness. So you have 4 arrows, and these are different ways in which cancer can progress. Now, if it progresses really fast, then that's really most of our visions of cancer, is that if you have it, you have to treat it immediately, otherwise it's going to expand, metastatize, and kill you. And that does happen, and it's a rare thing, but it does happen, especially considering the therapies that are applied to it. Then there are the slower growing ones. Eventually they cross the dotted line, which you get symptoms, and then if it's not treated, it can cause death before other causes of death. And that's the category that, yes, intervention, certain types of screening, including mammography. I personally think thermography makes infinitely more sense. It's non-ionizing. It picks up the heat signature so that you can find out on a physiological basis whether it's inflammation-driven, if there's angiogenesis, 10 years before a calcified lesion emerges in an X-ray. So thermography is really an important thing. Then you have the slow to grow, and then you have the very slow, and you have the non-progressive. You know, this has actually been discovered with prostate cancer, and the reason why PSA screenings aren't being recommended is because by age 70, the majority of men, if they were to be biopsied, would have cancer of the prostate. It's overtreatment that generally creates the same symptoms, if not worse symptoms, that first created the clinical appearance of the condition. So here's another thing that's really important, is how overdiagnosis works to inflate the survival statistics. So if you screen, well actually if you have 1,000 women who are diagnosed with breast cancer, 10 years later, 500 are dead and 100 are alive. That's a 10% 10-year survival rate. Now if you've employed screening and you've added another 4,000 women who have these early stage cancers to those original 1,000, it's going to basically affect the numerator and the denominator so that 4,000 are alive, they've survived, because by the way, they didn't find anything that would ever cause harm to them. And then 500 are dead. You can't see it, but it's an 82% survival rate at 10 years. So that's what happens, is it's a system that feeds itself. The more early diagnoses, the more you expand the statistics, the more successful you appear. Highly inefficient. You only get like 2 ATPs for your investment versus oxidative phosphorylation, which is like 29. But this is, yeah, good, this is perfect. So basically, the known causes are so clear. Okay, we have really basic things, obviously smoking and chemical exposure, things like chronic stress, downregulated immunity, upregulate, as we said, multi-drug resistance within cancer cells, viral transformation. Epstein-Barr is well known to immortalize cell lines in cancers. How do we get there? The prevailing conventional view is that we cohabitated with mice long enough, so it just jumped over. The vaccines are the most obvious explanation. Then we have nutritional deficiencies, inability to simply methylate certain cancer cells. Like 80% of breast cancer cells are hypomethylated, which means you need folic acid, B12, and B6, and other methyl donors. It's pretty simple stuff. And then you have things like high glycemic diet, and we talked about hypoxia. These are known. Okay. Again, another meme, early detection is the best form of protection and prevention. Absolutely absurd given what we talked about. And then if you want to move forward, same thing. Obviously we talked about it. It implies by racing for a cure. And so, winding things down, the reality is that the human body is like a flame anticipative structure. So at every given moment, death and life are completely spinning on itself. And that, you know, the interesting thing about cancer is that it's immortalized cells, and that's what inhibits us from living. So it's kind of an irony, but the reality is that even if you look at the lining, the cells lining the lining of our intestine, every 3 days, they're completely renewed. So based on what you're eating, what you're breathing in, what you're putting on topically, that's what your new body's going to be created from. Thanks to carbon-14 dating, we know that the average age of the human body is 7 to 10 years. So within a 7 to 10 year period, based again on what you're doing with nutrition, as well as obviously mind-body things, you're going to see a completely new body form. This is really fundamental, and I love this etymology. Many of you may know it, but health, the word, if you almost look at the Indo-European hypothetical root of all these Western languages, that little stem cell-like black dot in the middle.
Here is Old English, Proto-Germanic, Old Norse, Old English branch, and the farther back you go, the more these differentiated meanings coincide. That's the original meaning. So it comes from the roots whole, obviously.
Holy and sacred, and then to heal. So within the word health, we have a lot of direction and a lot of what we're dealing with mind-body interventions. It's already there. And the moment we reduce ourselves to a clinical object through the medical gaze, we've lost ourselves. We've been dispossessed. And so fundamentally, it does go back to awakening the inner physician that Hippocrates alluded to. When you were young and you scraped your knee and you put a Band-Aid on it, didn't pick at it, it healed. And that is a miracle. And there's no reason why cancer and many of the other diseases we consider chronic could not also undergo that radical transformation. It's our inability to believe that and follow through accordingly with nutrition, etc., that prevents it from happening. So I love this quote too. If one thing I'm certain, the body is not the measure of healing, peace is the measure. And then we think of C.S. Lewis, who said, you know, I don't have a soul, I am a soul, I have a body. So if we can reinfuse the discussion, looking at these older terms, I think we'll have a better sense of, you know, how to take back control of our health.